Good evening, Dom. What happened to me was such a strange experience that to this day I can't understand it. Since I really enjoy your videos, I thought it would be cool to share one of the weirdest stories I've ever lived through. I'm pretty skeptical, so this experience left my head spinning for a long time, even though it happened to me. I must have been around 10 years old and was in elementary school. Like almost every Saturday, one of my best friends came over to spend time at my house. We were both very aware of what was happening around us, so when something weird happened, we'd quickly show it to each other. At that time, my sister had a baby doll that would crawl on its own if you put batteries in it. I never paid much attention to it. I just found it curious that it blinked its eyes when you tilted it just right. One day, we went into the game room, and there was the doll right in the middle of the room again. At first, we didn't think much of it since I had seen that scene many times before, but I thought quickly and found it a bit strange that it was there, considering my sister hadn't played with it in years. Even so, I just threw the doll against the wall so it would hit and fall near the toy box. My friend, let's call him Johnny, liked to switch between playing outside and inside the house, so we went out for a bit. Everything seemed normal until we returned. As soon as we entered the hallway leading to the game room, Johnny froze, speechless, for a few seconds. I followed his gaze and saw the electronic doll crawling down the hallway coming straight toward us. It was made for that. It was the toy's main function. But since it was old and heavily used, it was dragging itself in a weird way as it advanced down the hallway. I looked at Johnny and we both thought the same thing instantly. It had to be my sister. It had to be, because that doll wouldn't have worked with the old, leaking AA batteries still in it. We both went over to the doll, and when we picked it up, it let out the typical cry that would activate when someone squeezed it. We called my sister, but no response. Confused, we searched the whole house. We discovered she was still sleeping and couldn't have gone near the doll all day. Just to be clear, my family isn't the type to pull pranks on each other, especially with something as scary as a doll. At this point, Johnny and I started to get a little freaked out, so we put the doll under a pile of toys in the game room and left it there. Thankfully, in the following weeks, we didn't have any more issues during our playtime. One weekend, my friend and I were sitting at the dining table in my house. He was in front of me and behind me was the living room with some sofas and 2 huge bookshelves. We were having a normal conversation, and in the middle of it, he took a sip of soda. Suddenly, he spat it all over the table. I was surprised, especially because he was always very calm. "What happened?" I asked. He just pointed behind me in silence. When I turned to look, I froze. There was that doll, sitting right on top of one of the giant bookshelves, a considerable distance from where I was, facing directly at us. We both ran to my mom, who was outside at the time, and asked if she had put the doll there. It's worth mentioning that neither I nor my friend could have reached the top of the bookshelf since it was nearly twice our height. We were even more creeped out when my mom asked which doll we were talking about. Considering that no one in my family would play a prank like that, my dad was away, and neither my friend nor I would joke around with each other like that, we started to panic. Something was definitely wrong with that doll. We asked my mum to get the doll for us, and we took it to the trash bins outside, on my family's rural property, where it stayed for a long time. For a few weeks, that was the end of the story. We started to forget about what happened until one weekend when I woke up and Johnny wasn't around. Sometimes I even wondered if he had been the one putting the doll in strange places. But that morning I was sure that theory was wrong. I went to the kitchen, which has a glass door connected to the front porch. When I looked outside, I froze. The doll was stuck in the middle of the path leading to the glass door, as if it had been crawling toward the door, with its face turned to the ground. I told my mom everything Johnny and I had been through. She's a religious person who doesn't usually fear much, but for some reason dolls always made her uncomfortable. She immediately went outside, grabbed the doll, and said she would take care of it. I asked her later what she did with the doll, and she told me she waited for it to dry since it had been soaked by the rain, and then she burned it, throwing the remaining plastic and electronic parts in the trash. We never had any other experiences with that doll again, but to this day, I still wonder what could have caused all of that, since it didn't make sense for it to be anyone in my family. Like I said, I'm a skeptic, but this story still puzzles me. If you enjoy stories of paranormal, strange, and unexplained events, I'd love for you to join our growing community. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes. I'm gathering some great stories for the next video, and it would be a shame if you missed it. And if you'd like to support the channel, just leave a like. That already helps a lot. I recently started a new job that my best friend helped me get. He hadn't told me anything about it beforehand. We worked the night shift 3 times a week. We received shipments, and normally we had about 6 people on the team. On other days there were only 3 and sometimes just 1 when things were quieter. The store had 16 aisles, and aisles 14 to 16 were all the way in the back. On my first day, which was a truck unloading day, they assigned me to work in aisles 8 and 9. Since I was new, they took it easy on me, as those aisles were easier. There was someone else working in aisle 10, right near me. While I was doing my thing, I saw a dark shadow pass by quickly out of the corner of my eye. I found it strange because the place it went to was a dead end. There was nothing there. At the time, I thought it was the other employee, since he was wearing black. After I finished, I went to aisle 10 and found him sitting on the floor, working on the lower shelves. "Did you walk past me a few minutes ago?" I asked. But he said no. So I went to aisle 2, where my friend was. I told him what I had seen, and he told me that he had also seen those shadows but hadn't mentioned it before. He wanted me to discover it on my own and then come tell him. He explained that he always sees the shadow out of the corner of his eye, but when he looks directly, it disappears. After a few months, new people started working there, and they also began to see the shadow moving. They came to us to tell their stories, and we had never said anything beforehand, precisely so as not to influence what they might notice. Once I was working with another colleague. My friend had taken the night off. It was around 6 in the morning when we finished the work and headed to the front of the store to get ready to open and be replaced by the morning crew. We were talking about the strange things we had experienced there, the dark figures, the footsteps, strange sounds, when suddenly we heard a loud plastic bag sound, and a loaf of bread flew off the shelf a few meters from where we were standing. We looked at each other, not believing what we had just seen and heard. We went over, picked up the bread, put it back in place, and tried to figure out how it could have fallen. We couldn't. We tapped the side of the shelf, the base, and nothing. Then I hit my hand against the bag, and it made the same sound we had heard before. The bread had been thrown forcefully off the shelf. Then, out of nowhere, the door handle of the office behind us started shaking very quickly. We stood there stunned. That movement lasted only a few seconds until we heard the front doors open. The morning manager had just arrived. On another occasion, just before midnight, a cashier came rushing toward me. She stopped and asked if I had knocked on the bathroom door. I didn't. You came from that direction, and I was walking in the opposite direction. It couldn't have been me, I replied. She asked where the other employee was. I answered, aisle 16, all the way in the back, and my friend is in the office where I just came from. She hurried off, and the next time I saw her, she was clocking out and leaving in a rush. Later, my friend told me that she went to the office and asked to see the camera footage near the bathroom from about 10 minutes earlier. Since he was the night shift manager, he had access to the system. When he rewound the video, he said something strange happened. They saw her entering the bathroom, but out of nowhere the screen filled with static for about a minute, and it only came back when she was already leaving in a hurry. That blank minute was exactly when she said she heard 3 loud knocks on the door. Another night we were having power issues, so all the store lights were dim, not as bright as usual. There were 3 of us working that day, and I was assigned to aisle 16, which bothered me because of the poor lighting and the creepy feeling that part of the store always had. Around 2 in the morning, my friend came to call me for lunch, since we always ate at that time. While I was finishing cleaning and we were talking, we heard a noise right next to us in aisle 15 and then a growl. Just thinking about it now gives me chills. We were out of breath, looked at each other wide-eyed and ran out. We ran past our other co-worker who asked what had happened. We told him and he said that earlier that night, while he was grabbing things to work in aisle 12, he fell to the floor. I felt like someone had pushed me, and I heard laughter right after. I didn't want to say anything at the time because I thought you wouldn't believe me, he said. For the same reason, we didn't want to talk about what we had just experienced either. The three of us went to the office to check the camera in aisle 15. What we saw there was chilling. Against the shelves, a shadow seemed to crawl sideways, like Spider-Man climbing a wall, if you can imagine that. After that, we stuck together all night, helping each other with whatever needed to be done. I'll stop with the stories here because otherwise this email will never end. There was another night when the three of us were in the basement, storing some things, talking and laughing. The stairs that led to the basement were old and made a lot of noise, so it was easy to hear if someone was coming down. The store had just the three of us there when suddenly our co-worker asked us to be quiet and pointed toward the stairs. We all went silent and started listening. We heard heavy footsteps, like someone wearing boots, slowly coming down the steps. We froze, exchanging glances in silence as the footsteps got closer and stopped right before the last step, just before we could see who it was. We walked together toward the corner to peek. There was no one there. These days, I don't work there anymore. From what I hear from the people I still know, they got rid of the night shift. No one wanted to work it anymore. I have many stories about the apartments where I've lived, but I'll share this one here. My grandmother had a very special way of alerting us when something was about to happen. I always heard her telling stories about the spirits of relatives, but I found it all fascinating and nothing more. I was quite skeptical, but I still listened. We lived in an apartment with some strange activity, but we didn't pay much attention to it. When we moved to a bigger apartment that belonged to my uncle, my grandmother and I were picking up some bags of wires, and suddenly she stopped and seemed a bit uncomfortable. "Are you okay?" I asked. She told me there was something in that building that didn't want us there. Since I was the skeptic in the family, I just replied, "Well, it's too late now, isn't it?" Later, I would regret making that joke. It was a little before Christmas in 1996, at my mom's apartment. When you walked in and sat on the couch, you could see straight into the kitchen. She was watching her favorite movie, It's a Wonderful Life, and I, feeling a bit bored, wasn't paying much attention to the TV. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, it seemed like something flew by the door. I looked, and as usual, I thought I was just tired. Then it happened again, going the other way. I looked again and told myself I must be imagining things. Once more I saw something at the door, and this time I thought, I'm not going to look. But, like in horror movies when you tell the character not to go and they still do, I looked. And there it was, at the door, the outline of a man, but it was just a shadow, with no details. Now I could see it clearly. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't look away. It seemed to last forever, but in reality, it must have only been 2 or 3 minutes. My brother asked me what I had seen, and that's when I realized I wasn't sure. He went to the kitchen with our dog, looking around, and the dog started growling in that low way, something he never did, but suddenly let out a yelp as if he had been hurt. He ran to the living room and hid under the couch. We never figured out what that thing was, but we moved out a week later. Recently, I drove by the place and saw that it was being renovated, turning the old apartments into a proper house, knocking down the walls. And all I can think is, could it have come back? That night made me a true believer. My family moved into the house of my childhood when I was around 2 years old. My older sister was 5 at the time. The new house was a late 19th century construction with thick stone walls between 60 and 70 centimeters thick, which is quite common here in Germany. Unfortunately, I don't know anything about the people who built or lived there before. I only know the men from whom my parents bought the place. Personally, I've always been a bit of a skeptic, mainly because I didn't see anything strange during my childhood or adolescence, but my older sister had a different experience. On a hot summer day, around the end of July or the beginning of August, we were playing in the backyard near the huge piles of wood we had stacked to dry. Each pile was about 6 feet tall and at least 5 meters long. When we took a break from playing, I went inside to get something to drink. My sister stayed outside and walked around the wood piles. When I came back, she seemed a bit confused and even scared, so I asked what had happened. She said that as soon as I went inside, she saw a head peeking from behind the wood piles, moving along them. At first, she thought it was our father hiding to scare her, so she tiptoed to try to surprise him at the end of the pile. However, when she got there and looked around the corner, there was no one. But the strangest thing was that she felt an intense cold at that moment, despite the heat easily surpassing 30 degrees Celsius. Our father had been in the kitchen the whole time, with me and my mother, and the yard was fenced in with a tall gate so no one could have entered or left. Additionally, we lived in a small village, with that part of the yard facing an open field, making it even more unlikely that someone could have been hiding. That was my sister's first major paranormal encounter. Over the years, she continued to have similar experiences, seeing people who weren't there, hearing scratching sounds at night, or the creaking of the floorboards as if someone was walking around the house. As I mentioned, I didn't believe much in paranormal things at the time, so I didn't give it much thought, as I never saw or heard anything myself. My mother, on the other hand, had a different perspective. Especially at night, since our father almost always worked the night shift, we were often alone, but it was never an issue. We had a dog, a German Shepherd, who would protect us with his life, so we felt safe enough. And as I said before, we lived in a tiny village, but about 20 years later, my mother told me about some of the experiences she had, and one in particular stuck with me. One night, my mother was unpleasantly awakened, thanks to our dog barking at some random animal, maybe a rabbit or a hedgehog, she imagined. This happened from time to time, and since she was a light sleeper, it wasn't unusual. Since she was already awake, she decided to get up and grab a glass of water. However, as she prepared to get out of bed, she told me that she saw a dark shadow crawling into the room from the hallway. At first, it just looked like a black blot, but soon it started to rise from the walls and floor, floating in the middle of the room and quickly approaching her. She described the thing as a large manta ray, suspended in the air with a head devoid of any details in the middle of that dark mass that made up its body. The fins that extended from this figure reached out toward her. My mother was paralyzed with fear, unable to react, and when the creature was just about to touch her, it vanished into thin air. Still in shock, she sat on the bed for a few minutes before hiding under the covers. That night, she gave up on getting that glass of water. Now, talking about my first personal experience, which, to be honest, wasn't as scary, but still gave me chills. My grandmother passed away in 2021, and after the funeral, my whole family gathered at the house where I grew up. We were talking for several hours when the phone started ringing in a strange way. It was one of those cordless phones that sit on a base, but the sound wasn't the usual ringtone. It was a series of rapid, successive rings, something I had never heard before. My mother picked up the phone, answered, but all she could hear was static. And to make it even stranger, there was no record of any incoming calls. Pretty weird. Later that same night, I felt the blanket being gently pulled off my shoulder, and right after that, a warm hand rested on it. I knew I was alone in the room with the door closed, but oddly enough, I didn't feel fear or anxiety. In fact, it was a very comforting sensation, and deep in my heart, I knew it was my grandmother saying goodbye one last time. Similar things happened to almost all the closest members of my family. It was on that day that I finally became a believer. My family owns a property that is literally in the middle of nowhere. On that property, we have a very, very old cabin. It's been there for at least 2 generations. The story we were told is that the people who lived in that cabin were the daughter of a local Native American chief, who was banished from the tribe for marrying a white man, something that was extremely frowned upon at the time. They say the chief felt bad for having to banish his own daughter, so he gave her and her husband a piece of land far from the village. From what I remember, her husband ended up dying in some way. and the story goes that she was devastated and alone, cursing the house after the tribe refused to take her back after his death. Now, I never believed in curses, and although I always liked the story, I never gave much credit to the old tale my grandparents used to tell me. However, the cabin has always made me feel a bit uneasy. Today, I'm over 40 years old, and when we were planning my wedding on the property, a relative asked me if I would go inside the cabin alone or let my kids go in. I replied, "No way, I'm never stepping foot in that cursed place again, nor will I let them go in. And I'm not the only one in the family who feels this way. Throughout my life, that cabin always felt strange and dark, no matter the time of day." I've heard others describe a heavy feeling in the atmosphere, and I think that's a good way to put it, a dark, unsettling weight. Even on the sunniest days, that place always had this vibe. There were always a bunch of dead flies around the windows, and the furniture was old and dusty. From the moment I stepped through the old screen door, I felt uncomfortable. There was never a clear reason for this, so I always attributed it to my imagination, which was maybe a bit exaggerated. When I was in my early 20s, my girlfriend and I decided to spend our summer vacation on my family's property. There were a lot of people around, and I remember there were several trailers, campers, and motorhomes. Since sleeping space was limited, I decided to stop acting scared and face my fear of the cabin. I went in with our stuff, threw the bags on the couch in the bedroom, set up one of the beds, and my friend did the same on the other. The night was super fun. We spent time chatting, laughing, and roasting marshmallows by the fire. When it was quite late, we went back to the cabin to sleep. My friend is really funny, and we always laugh a lot when we're together, so we were relaxed, with no tension in the air. We lay down in our beds and kept laughing and chatting until we heard some strange noises, which startled my friend. I tried to calm her down, explaining that the cabin was really old and that there were probably rats around, so it was better not to worry about it. She held it together for 2 more rounds of those scratching noises until, suddenly, she jumped into my bed. I didn't mind, especially since I wasn't feeling all that comfortable inside either. We lay there, listening to the noises again, and I started explaining exactly what we were hearing, as I was used to rats in some parts of the property. When the scratching sounds repeated, I said they were just looking for food, and that seemed to calm my friend a bit. Suddenly, we started hearing banging on the walls and in the living room. There's a bathroom in a small hallway between the bedroom and the living room, and honestly, it's the creepiest part of the cabin with no clear explanation why. My friend was so terrified that I suggested we turn off the bedroom light, hoping we might see what was causing the noise and praying we wouldn't step on some lost little rat. I jumped off the bed to the couch, which was right by the door and the light switch. I quickly found the switch and turned on the light. We both looked around, trying to spot any sign of, well, anything. But we didn't see a thing. I said it was probably rats and they must have scurried away when I jumped. I turned off the light again, and we waited to hear another sound to turn it on and try to catch them in the act. After a few seconds, we heard a thud in the bedroom and a crash in the living room. I turned on the light and laughed, because once again, there was nothing in sight. I stepped off the couch, and out of nowhere, my bag flew from the couch to the other side of the floor. My friend screamed, and all I could say was, "To hell with this," as I grabbed her, and we ran out. As we passed the bathroom on our way to the living room, I saw that all the furniture had been turned upside down, as if someone had tossed it all around. I didn't mention this to her. We ran toward the kitchen and the screen door, and suddenly it occurred to me that maybe my uncles were playing a prank, as they loved to do that. When we reached the screen door, I saw that the latch was still locked. There was no other entrance. The other door was locked too. So, we ran straight to my parents' trailer and told them what had happened. My dad went back with me to the cabin to check the furniture, and everything was back in place. I can't explain it. I have no idea what it was or why it happened. I don't even know if they believed me, or if any family members believe me to this day, except for my brother, who feels the same way about the cabin. But honestly, I don't care. My friend Carolina knows what happened, and so do I, and I will never set foot in that cabin again. We talked about it once a few years later. She looked at me and asked, "Did you see that all the furniture was scattered around?" I'm not sure if it was comforting or not to realize that she had seen it too. Now, we've moved to a rural area in a small town. The house is old and we hadn't been here long before strange things started happening. On one of the first nights, we only had a few pots and pans unpacked to cook with since we were in the middle of renovations. So we hand-washed one of the pans we used and left it drying on a mat on the counter. In the middle of the night, I heard a loud noise, but nothing followed after. I asked my husband to check, but he didn't find anything out of place. When I woke up in the morning, I saw the pan on the floor with a big dent in it. Honestly, I have no idea how it fell from the counter. I didn't feel any strange presence or anything like that, so I didn't think much of it. But after that, other weird things started happening. One day, around 11 a.m., I was sitting on the bed with my cat, reading. Suddenly, my cat, who I had only ever heard meow, sat up, stared intently at the bedroom door and started growling, then hissing. I couldn't see anything, I couldn't hear anything, it was just strange. About 6 months later, I was lying in bed at night with my dog, a golden retriever named Ryan Reynolds. Yes, that's really his name. Reading, trying to relax before going to sleep. That night, I was home with my kids, and my husband was away on a business trip. So even though it's a small community full of good people who look out for you, I still felt a bit anxious. Anyway, I was about to finish my chapter and go to sleep when suddenly I heard someone running down the hallway. Ryan Reynolds jumped off the bed and looked at me. I have a son with autism and some health issues who sometimes talks in his sleep, so I thought sleepwalking might be his new thing, though running isn't exactly his strong suit. I assumed it was him and got worried, thinking he might be trying to leave the house. I got out of bed and called his name. There was no response. I passed by the kids' rooms and both of them were fast asleep, sprawled out in their beds, with no signs of having moved. They both seemed to be in a deep sleep. The dog ran into the living room, but there was nothing there. This one I really don't know how to explain or describe. Once again, I was lying in bed at night and started hearing a strange sound. It sounds crazy, but it was like the sound of a heartbeat. It wasn't super loud, but you could hear it clearly. I woke my husband and asked if he could hear it too. He said yes, and mind you, he's quite the skeptic about these things. I asked what it could be, but he had no idea. We went to investigate, and the sound was stronger in the guest room, which is next to the kids' room. The closer we got to the shared wall, the louder it got. The weirdest part is that in the kids' room there was no sound. None. And then we heard something like breathing, as if the house was inhaling and exhaling. We couldn't figure out where it was coming from or what it could be. My husband eventually went back to sleep, but I stayed in bed, listening to that heartbeat sound mixed with strange breathing. The night was calm with no wind, and we never heard that sound again. Later, my neighbors told me that a friend of theirs who lived here passed away a few years ago from cancer. They said she seemed like a fun person, so when I'm alone, I sometimes talk to her, asking her to help with tidying up the house more instead of just moving things or flickering the lights. That would be great, right? A wish of mine, of course. My son, on the other hand, refuses to be alone in the living room. He says he feels like someone is watching him. He insists it doesn't feel like something bad, but he just doesn't like the sensation. I guess only time will tell if it's just our imagination or if there's something more. And now, I have one last story to share tonight. The person who went through this had several brief experiences, but the reason I want to share it is because it's one of those rare ghost stories that brings a sense of comfort and positivity rather than being scary or terrifying.